In the early hours of June 20th, 2001, a quiet suburb outside Houston, Texas, woke up like any other. The sun rose, birds sang, cars pulled out of driveways. Inside a modest family home, 5 children were still asleep, and their mother was already awake. This is not a story that begins with screaming, or rage, or chaos. It begins with silence. This is the case of Andrea Yates. Hello, I'm Ellie Calderwyn. Andrea Yates was not what people expected a killer to look like. She was soft-spoken, highly intelligent, a former nurse. She was deeply devoted to her children, and even more devoted to her faith. Friends described her as obedient, reserved, almost painfully self-critical. She married Rusty Yates, a man equally committed to conservative Christian ideals. Together, they believed parenting was not just a responsibility, it was a test of salvation. And Andrea believed failure meant eternal consequences. After the birth of her 4th child, something inside Andrea Yates began to collapse. At first, the changes were subtle. She stopped laughing, stopped engaging. She stared into space for long stretches of time, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Then she stopped eating. She barely slept. And soon, she stopped speaking altogether. Andrea was hospitalized for the first time after suffering a complete mental breakdown. Doctors described her condition as severe postpartum depression, later reclassified as postpartum psychosis, one of the most dangerous psychiatric disorders associated with childbirth. She was not just sad, she was losing her grip on reality. Andrea attempted suicide. Then, after being released, she tried again. Medical records show that psychiatrists were alarmed. They warned that another pregnancy could push her past the point of recovery. Their words were unambiguous. Another child could kill her. But Andrea returned home, returned to caregiving, returned to the expectations of motherhood. And despite every warning, she became pregnant again. 5 children in 9 years. Each birth placed unbearable strain on a mind that was never allowed to heal. As Andrea's mental health deteriorated, the beliefs surrounding her grew darker. Andrea and her husband became deeply influenced by the teachings of a fringe preacher named Michael Warrenetsky, a man whose ideology rejected modern Christianity and emphasized punishment over grace. His message was relentless. Women, he taught, were inherently sinful. Sexual thoughts were corrupt. Motherhood was a sacred burden, one that could condemn children to hell if handled incorrectly. These were not gentle sermons. They were warnings. Warnings about eternal fire, about Satan's constant presence, about mothers being personally accountable for their children's salvation. Andrea absorbed these teachings completely. In her journals, she wrote about feeling evil, She believed her thoughts were impure, that her mind was broken, that Satan spoke through her. And slowly, she began to believe something far more terrifying, that her children were already corrupted because of her. What might have been dismissed as extremist rhetoric by a healthy mind became, for Andrea, undeniable truth. By the beginning of 2001, Andrea Yates was no longer anchored to reality. She believed television programs were messages from Satan, that reading distracted her from God, that laughter in her home was sinful. She stopped bathing. She stopped brushing her teeth. She stopped responding to the world around her. Her thoughts narrowed to one obsession: judgment. Andrea believed she was being watched by God, by demons, by an invisible force tallying her failures as a mother. She believed she had already failed, and in her mind, failure meant damnation. She began to believe that if her children lived long enough under her care, they would be lost forever. Eternal suffering. In that distorted reality, death was no longer cruelty. It was protection. It was obedience. It was, she believed, the only way to save them. The morning of June 20th, 2001, began without urgency. Andrea Yates woke up early and waited. She waited for the sound of the door closing, for the car pulling out of the driveway, for the house to become still. Only then did she begin with her plan. Not frantically, but slow and deliberately. She moved through the house with quiet purpose, guided not by emotion, but by certainty. In her mind, this was not violence. It was necessity. Later, investigators would note her calm demeanor, the absence of panic, the absence of resistance. When it was over, Andrea carefully arranged her children's bodies. There was no attempt to hide what she had done. She picked up the phone and called the police. Then, she called her husband. Her voice did not shake. "I did something bad," she said. The reaction was swift and unforgiving. Across the country, Andrea Yates was transformed into a symbol, a monster, a cautionary tale, a mother stripped of humanity. The media asked only one question: how could a woman do this? But inside the courtroom, a different story began to emerge. Doctors testified about years of mental illness, about suicide attempts, about repeated hospitalizations, about warnings that went ignored. They spoke of postpartum psychosis, an illness capable of distorting morality itself. The prosecution argued that Andrea knew right from wrong, that she understood the consequences. The jury agreed. In 2002, Andrea Yates was convicted of capital murder. She was sentenced to life in prison. For many, justice had been served. But for others, something felt deeply wrong. Years later, the foundation of that conviction began to crack. It was discovered that a key prosecution expert had given false testimony, citing a television episode that did not exist, suggesting Andrea had been inspired by fiction rather than delusion. The conviction was overturned. A retrial was ordered. In 2006, the jury heard the case again. This time, they heard everything. The full medical history, the psychotic breaks, the obsessive religious guilt, the inability to distinguish reality from belief. They heard how Andrea Yates believed she was saving her children, not harming them. And when deliberations ended, the verdict was different. Andrea Yates was found not guilty by reason of insanity. She was not released. She was committed to a state psychiatric hospital, where she remains today. Not as a villain, but as a reminder of what happens when illness is misunderstood and warnings are ignored. The Andrea Yates case forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth: that faith can become dangerous when it feeds delusion, that motherhood does not protect against psychosis, and that warnings mean nothing when they are ignored. Andrea Yates did not snap. She deteriorated, slowly, visibly, desperately. And the real tragedy is how many chances there were to stop it. I'm Ellie Calderwyn. Thank you for listening.